So this first one, direct to Mark, though I think Erin and Dawn probably have some answers as well, but I'll give Mark the first crack. And it's, how do you enact local policy that may be contrary to the federal government's plan/ideals? Not that that is relevant.
Well, we spent this last year doing that at the state level quite a bit. But it sort of depends. And what you have to understand is the notion of preemption, where the federal government weighs in. It can weigh in a couple of different ways on policy. It can create policy and effectively clear the field that prohibits the states from acting, or it can weigh in a way that allows states to continue to act. And I'll just give you an example, and one that I'm very worried about right now. The Clean Air Standard that the federal government passed, this goes back decades, and California had a waiver. So we have our own fuel standards, the CAFE standards in California, that this is tailpipe emissions, vehicle emissions, that was more strict than the federal standard. The current administration is threatening to take away that waiver, which then California would be essentially required to be compliant with the state, with the federal standard. The interesting part of that, however, is because we're such a large part of the vehicle market that all of the manufacturers decided, instead of creating a California vehicle, which they did for a while, there were California standard vehicles and then there were the rest of the country. They now adopt effectively the California standard. They just manufacture to one standard. So we have, by our standard, have benefited the entire country. So what happens if that waiver goes away and the federal standard is now what vehicle manufacturers go to? Are they going to then retool and change back? I don't know. It's an interesting question. But it depends on how specific the federal policy is and whether the state can maneuver that. Usually we work in concert with federal rules, but right now we are looking at federal rules and where they're being rolled back, where we need to step up to kind of fill those gaps. Where we can't fill those gaps, we're going to be kind of stuck with whatever the federal standard is. But we're doing that now more than has ever been done, looking at those differences.
You guys want to add anything?
I don't have anything to add. That's beyond my world.
Okay. There's a series of questions that are sort of revolving around the same issue, and that's basically, what are the most effective ways to communicate, to get your voice heard? We live in an age where there's online petitions, there's, you can email, you can call, you can show up in person. And so from your guys' vantage points and experience, what works best? Erin, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so in my limited experience in the last couple years of being in policy, and again, coming from this fellowship perspective, I've been hearing that those, petitions and forms, you sign your name and it gets submitted, those are certainly counted from what I've heard, and Mark can, correct me if I'm wrong, but the most effective way to kind of make yourself known on an issue is tying up a phone line or going in and being there in person. I also, personally, I email my local representatives and often get really thoughtful email responses back that are at least helpful for me to understand kind of where my representatives stand on an issue, because often the email will say, hey, thank you for your interest in, net neutrality was the most recent one I did. And Jimmy Panetta gave, the whole, this is what our office does on this and this is what we're going to do in the future. So it's just helpful information gathering from a constituent perspective. But I would say, yeah, phone or be in person, or I don't know. That would be my input.
I'll let Mark answer.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to burst your bubble, but it wasn't from Jimmy. And not...
No, definitely not.
Yeah, it's staff writes that. Mm-hmm. And we get thousands of emails. I can't imagine what Jimmy gets. I'm in the state assembly. Every assembly district is about the same size. I represent almost 500,000 people. And I represent an area of constituents who are very active and engaged, so we hear a lot from people. And in my office, this is not true in all offices, and it's good to hear that they got back to you, is if you send an email in or write a letter in, you will get a response. If you are sending a letter in that's the same thing as 1,000 other letters, you're not going to get a response. And those to me don't get counted as 1,000 letters. It's just 1,000 contacts. And there's a difference between a contact, because we just sort of count those up, who's weighing in on what side, versus the thoughtful letter, email, same thing, where you've put your own take on it. That will get a little bit more attention and a better response. But I will tell you, and I think Jimmy's the same, all of the responses that go out, I see. Now, they're going to be similar when staff is responding depending on the question that comes in, but I always know what my constituents are asking me, what the issues are, and approve the responses out, even though I don't have time to do them. So don't be afraid of weighing in. You do get counted in that way. And for some of my colleagues, sometimes we will orchestrate to get their phones lit up by constituents on particular issues. And that can have an impact when there's a vote that's coming up and they're getting 800 calls over a 2-day period. Then they're going to be afraid to kind of go sideways on that issue. And we do orchestrate that to try and make sure that we do get votes. But it's also important, we also pay more attention to our constituents than we do to others. But also back to that thing that you said, if you represent a group. So if you call up from the aquarium and you have an issue and we have a relationship with the aquarium, you will get that call answered. If you just call up, say, I'm a constituent, you'll get a conversation, but it's hard to know kind of always what to do with that information. But if you're coming in with a group or with a perspective or have built a relationship, then you have a much better chance of kind of getting through the filters that are there to actually get somebody's attention.
So I wanted to bring in, there's two things that I wanted to kind of clarify. One is, it seems like kind of behind what a lot of us are thinking is that we want policy to do something that we collectively think is important. And I'm guessing with this group, maybe I'm wrong, you guys can tell me if I am, that collective thing is something that's better for the environment. It increases biodiversity, it builds in climate change resilience, it makes more sustainable fisheries. Those kinds of things are what we're trying to achieve through these policy decisions. And so I'm going to assume that with my answer, because I think that there's a million things that you can do with policy, and I just want to make sure that it's easier for me to focus on that. The second thing is, and no offense to Mark, but policy just doesn't happen with a politician. Policy decisions are made at all kinds of levels. They're made within the Monterey Bay Aquarium. They're made within NGOs. They're decisions about what's the policy of this group of people. And so I think it's important for us to think about, well, who do we need to make this decision? Who do we need to bring on board? And so, it's not just putting something out on a Twitter account, it's deciding who makes these policy decisions. So I'll give you an example. I work with protected species, seabirds in particular. And for many years during the Obama administration, the question was, what do we need to do in order to get these species listed on the Endangered Species Act? That was the policy, because the Obama administration was more interested in hearing that. Now with the Trump administration, the policy is, how do we delist things, right? Which in some ways is just two sides of the same coin. If you talk to the elected officials within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and you come to them saying, I can give you some ideas of how you might delist this critically endangered species of seabird. Well, you're going to get good conservation, you're just doing it a different way. And so what I'm saying is that understanding what you want to accomplish and who's making those policy decisions and what speaks to them will help you be effective. And again, it's not just trying to talk to people like Mark or Jimmy Panetta or whoever. It's actually understanding, I feel like the Monterey Bay Aquarium should be working on this issue. Who do I need to talk about in order to get the policy of the Monterey Bay Aquarium to move towards doing something different? I happen to have started a nonprofit and a for-profit, and we're making decisions all the time in terms of what things we work on. And so that's what I would add to the conversation so far is understanding what it is you're trying to accomplish, what policy decisions need to be made in order to make that happen, and work at that level. Because sometimes that's a lot more tractable level, and you get a lot more done trying to work with certain key individuals as opposed to this huge legislative body, for example. That's all I have to say about that.
Sort of following up on some of those comments, I mean, one of the questions kind of alludes to the concern that scientists often have about them becoming politicized when they advocate or when they get involved in any sort of political decision making. Many scientists worry about becoming identified as advocates, for example, on a particular thing. So how has that influenced your involvement in policymaking?
You talking to me?
We'll start with you, Don.
Okay. Well, I have no problem getting involved in policymaking, but you have to make sure the science is behind you, right? So so now we're moving from the realm of Mark, I think, really in an insightful way, talked about how science plays itself out when you're actually trying to write laws. If it works, you'll use it. If it doesn't, you'll ignore it, right? As a scientist, you can't ignore the science. So I think that as long as you have strong, credible science, and an even better peer-reviewed science, and you can actually even work with your peer-reviewed, your colleagues, then you're starting from the right spot. If you are just trying to push an agenda, then I think you lose your credibility really fast. And you only have to lose your credibility once as a scientist, and it's gone it's really hard to get it back again. And so through my career, I like to feel like I have credibility because I tend to kind of base what I'm working on, I'm advocating for from science. And so I guess what I'd say is I don't have any problem advocating if that's what the science says. But you also have to be listening to, if the science changes or the hypotheses don't play themselves out, then you also have to be willing to listen to that. One example that might be, we were talking about this just during the break here, was marine protected areas, right? At one point this is gonna solve everything. And then as the science came out, I realized, well, there's not a lot of evidence of the spillover effect in marine protected areas. And so you need to kind of adapt. I'm not so sure we can sell fishermen on the idea of fish coming from a reserve and you getting to catch that fish in the future. And if you advocate for that and it doesn't happen, then your credibility goes down the drain. So even though I'd like to see a lot of MPAs, maybe spillover effect might not be the best argument in order to make that happen. And so I think that there you have to kind of, and I might be wrong, Mark Carr, I keep on asking Mark Carr to tell me I'm wrong, and he hasn't effectively done that yet. So anyway, that's just an example.
Just as a follow-up, though, I mean, even if you do all those things, you know, your science is peer-reviewed, you stick to it, you take into account emerging information. It seems in this day and age that we live in, if it's a contentious issue, your science will be politicized, right? Regardless of all those, you having done the right things.
Yeah, let me weigh in on this because I always get this one wrong. I'm not a scientist, and so I don't have that discipline that you do, but I'm a policymaker, and so trying to convince somebody about something is what I do, regardless of its merit sometimes. That's sort of what we do. But there's a difference between advocating for the science and advocating for a particular policy. Now, you may have come to the conclusion that marine protected areas are good. Maybe there are. So let me politicize it, because that's my job, that's my role. But the science that you build and that changing science about the benefit of the marine, because who cares about marine protected areas, right? Well, it's about sustainable fisheries. It's about biodiversity. It's about ensuring that we have certain resources along the coast. That doesn't of itself lead to a particular policy solution. It will inform that policy solution in the best world. But that's my job to translate that into a policy solution. But that solution may not work after a period of time, or science may learn something in the middle. And if you get caught up in the solution as opposed to the science of learning and investigating for the end sort of broader goal like a sustainable fishery, then I think you do run the risk of getting kind of politicized. But I get
Erin,
accused of that all the time.
As a representative of a science-based, sometimes advocacy organization, how do you guys decide what you're going to advocate for?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that has been really interesting and great for me to learn, coming into my new role. I started 8 months ago. And really, all of our policy advocacy or just involvement at all is informed and based on foundational science, making sure that science is actually credible and is actually, something we want to stand on. So there's that first peer review, all these hoops you have to jump through basically to make sure that our stance is coming from that perspective. And I think as a mission-based institution, we have a little bit more leeway in that, we're very transparent about the fact that we are advocating for conservation of the oceans. Our mission is to inspire conservation of the oceans. So for us to be taking kind of a policy stance that's, informed by science, I think there's a little more leeway for us as far as an institution. But that being said, we are very, we want to make sure that the public has a lot of trust in us, and we make sure that we are protecting that trust by weighing in on issues that we really do think have credible science behind it. And we do advocate for the science itself. As Mark correctly pointed out, there's a really subtle but important difference there. So yeah, I hope that kind of gets to that, but I do think institutions, especially mission-based institutions, might have a little more leeway.
Well, and I can give you a good example, if I may. I know you got other questions here, but we were working on a seafood labeling bill, for example. And it's very important what we're trying to do is and there's some federal level stuff that's been working that's now not working, and maybe we're going to have to revisit this in California. But when fish is sold, having it labeled correctly. And one of the groups of advocates were really pushing that we inform consumers about farmed fish. And it was the aquarium that stepped in and said, now, wait a minute. Because all this was towards sustainable fisheries and being able to select the right fish so that a consumer knows if that purchase is putting fisheries at further risk or not. And there are some sustainably farmed fish. And it was the work that the aquarium did that got us to sort of slow down with what exactly the labels meant, because the science was saying, no, there are some aspects of farmed fish, and we've built this stigma around farmed fish for so many years that now we maybe have to correct that over time. And that's sort of science that led to that sustainable question around farmed fish and a lot of bad practices with farmed fish, to now more sustainable practices, even if it is aquaculture as opposed to wild-caught fish. And that's where an organization with the credibility of the aquarium can come in and literally stop that policy in its tracks, so that we went back to figure out what the best steps were going to be in light of what the feds were doing and what we needed to do. And so that's where the science really affected specific policy that we could have been making things worse.
There's a set of questions kind of from a scientific perspective. How do you best package your results for a wider audience? Why don't we start with Dawn and then Erin?
Well, so I'm thinking of an example. I was involved with a Krill Fishing Ban, and it started in a weird way. Years ago, I was on a Monterey Bay Sanctuary Advisory Panel working group, and because I work with whales and seabirds and they eat krill, I suggested that the sanctuary enact a krill fishing ban in the Monterey Bay Sanctuary. And they said, great, let's do that. And they took that and ran with it. So that was one thing where I felt like the science was behind it. It's a forage species. Why and the initial question was, well, why do we do that? No one's fishing for it. And I said, well, that's the easiest way to start to ban a fishery is when no one's doing it. And so that seemed proactive, and the sanctuary bought it and they went with it. Then all of a sudden, National Marine Fisheries Service said, no, the sanctuary doesn't regulate fisheries, we do. And the way we regulate fisheries is we set limits, and we do assessments, and we set limits, and then we say how much krill could be caught. And so then I was invited to a meeting to set the limits for krill fishing. And I said, this has gone horribly wrong, because what I thought was going to be a ban on krill fishing is now opening up the regulations to enable krill fishing. And so I was at the meeting. I said, is this the meeting where we say this is a really bad idea? I said, no, this is not that meeting. So I walked away from that thinking, boy, I really screwed up. And so this is getting to your question of how do you package your science? I decided I needed to repackage the science, talk about it as an importance as a forage species, how many other species depend upon it. At that time, there's a lot of ecosystem models that were showing how key krill was, because it kind of translates phytoplankton up the food chain. And so I kind of put that together in a paper, and it was just a one-page review paper, and I sent it to Oceana, who was, I think the group was working on the labeling things problem with that you're talking about a second ago, Mark. And Oceana, but I went beyond that. I went and I talked to the fishermen, the PCFFA, the fishing organization, because these guys fish salmon. Don't you guys care about krill? Because the reason salmon's pink is because they eat krill. And I found a number of fishing organizations, and I sent the same paper. So I packaged that to both nonprofits and fishermen, and I figured that at that point, we would get, if you have the nonprofit world and the fishermen both working on the same thing, pushing the same direction, that's a good thing, because almost never does that happen. And so they both went to the Pacific Fisheries Management Council, PMF, Pacific Marine Fisheries Council, and they advocated for the krill ban, and it happened. And so it was just a case of packaging it in a context of, ecosystem argument, but one that spoke both to the nonprofit but also the fishermen. So I think you just have to think about, in that case, who needed to be convinced and what information would be compelling to them that is based in science. I mean, I wasn't just making this stuff up. So
And it sounded like what was the right format. In this case, it was like a one-pager.
Oh yeah, you can't, no one's gonna read a science paper, forget it.
Yeah, starting simple. And when you get to the policy level, I mean, this sounds really silly, but it's true, that if you can give a policymaker a very simple statement that I can use to make me sound smarter than my colleagues about a particular area, then you win, because I will use it to death. And then, but I will have bought into whatever it is that is being worked, because we're not the experts. Again, you are. But if I can sound smarter, if I can bring something forward, if you can give me that, then I will listen to you.
And could I just add one more little piece, and then I'll shut up? And that is that you also need to figure out good analogies that speak to people. So how do you translate your science into something that speaks to people? And Jane Lubchenco said, this is not my idea, I think this is perfect. With all those hurricanes lately we've been having, people have been saying, is this because of climate change? And you can't, the science doesn't back you up to say, well, that hurricane was because of warmer oceans. The science doesn't back that up. So what Jane suggested is you find an analogy that does work. And the analogy she suggested was, imagine a batter on steroids. You can't ascribe any home run that batter hits to steroids, but on average, a batter on steroids is going to hit more home runs and hit those home runs further because of steroids. And so essentially climate change is like putting the climate on steroids, and we're likely to get more storms. We can't say which storm is because of climate change, but that's something that we can, and that was an analogy that I realized that would speak to a lot of people. And what she did is she translated her science into something that people could understand. And I don't know if people do that for you all the time, Mark, but that's...
Oh yeah, but that's exactly what I'm talking about. So I remember one local politician had learned the phrase, and this is around the marine protected areas, about the boff, the big old fat female. And I heard that again and again and again and again, but they were very proud of this. But now someone who has bought into the need and a little bit of the science, enough to then be able to translate that into his world, into sort of what I do. And so, yeah, a dumb sports analogy is always going to probably work. Yeah.
Yeah, from the aquarium's perspective, I mean, you guys are touching on everything that we at the aquarium do. It's like packaging. We have a bunch of in-house researchers little conservation research department, but we package our science, obviously, to both the public in the like flashy viral videos that we all see on social media, to peer-reviewed science as well as policy briefs. So I'm going to try to speak a little bit more to another aspect I think is really important is collaborative science. And when you are doing your own thesis, it's really important to reach out to others from potentially other scientific institutions that might have a constituency in an area you're trying to influence, or not trying to influence, but looking into an issue. An example I can give on that is not local or state, it's actually international, but we do a lot of bluefin tuna research and are teaming up with Japanese scientists to get some more data on basically the migratory path of these bluefin tuna. Where do they come from? Where do they spawn? Where do they live most of the time? And our policy team at the aquarium also, we have a seat on the U.S. negotiating team or whatever it's called, for the international, Pacific management of the tuna. And so the fact that we have these collaborative science relationships, really, the results of that science is not just this external body coming in and telling someone what their results were. It's the scientists from multiple constituencies, multiple places that are all at the table in these negotiations. So, to the extent to which you can collaborate, I think that always adds a strength to scientific results.
Fair number of these questions have been answered already just in the discussion, but just to put a little sharper point on what we have been talking about, this question says they're interested in science communication to the local public so that they support policy decisions and science more generally. So is it worthwhile, is their question, and what is the most effective way to begin doing that?
Well,
What do you guys
yeah,
think?
it can be if it's relevant. If there's a local debate, for example, about sea level rise or about something, and you have some science to talk about, then from a purely scientific perspective, and again, remember who your audience is. You're not writing a scientific paper, but putting in an op-ed or putting in something that explains a concept fairly simply can be very well received. If it's not an issue that's generally in the public's mind right now, they're not going to know what to do with it. They're not necessarily even going to read it. But if there's been a lot of flooding, for example, a lot of rainstorms which happened last winter, if somebody who had done a lot of research said, this is who I am, I've done a lot of this research here, that's in the caption at the end, and explain something in layperson's terms so that it's approachable, you now kind of develop some credibility and a bit of a name. And if you do that fairly consistently, there are some, like the local papers will put in letters to the editors as op-eds from folks who have no other credential in that they write, other than they write in a lot. And all of a sudden they become an expert on something, and they get an op-ed printed. And sometimes they're really off the wall. And so you can kind of develop a following or develop a voice that way, but it has to be something that's approachable, that's readable, that's understandable, and relevant to something that's going on enough for people to want to read it and to know what to do with it. But yeah, that is a way of getting your point across.
Just to add a little bit to that, and Mark, you can tell me if I'm wrong, this is because it's based on my little microcosm experience, and that is that I mentioned before I'm part of a local quasi-elected organization called the Davenport North Coast Association. That group has existed since 1953 in Davenport. And they even had to change the bylaws so that women could be part of the that's how old it is. Wow. But all that said is that organization has worked tirelessly for years on that part of the north coast of Santa Cruz County, the northern coastal area. Issue after issue, whether it's a national monument, whether it's homelessness along the coast, whatever it is, that organization works on those issues all the time, and they have kind of a body of people that are passionate about it. It's that it seems to me that this organization has developed a really good relationship with the local supervisors. And so oftentimes it seems like the supervisors are looking for some public entities that can kind of help gauge a sense of the community, what's the right decision, what's the community going to get behind. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that finding a collection of people that are passionate about a certain thing or a certain geographic area and being persistent and coming up with feasible solutions, thinking about all the different aspects, all the different pieces, not just being, some diehards about nothing in my backyard. You gain credibility and you can educate the local, your other neighbors and things like that, but you're also going to be listened to. And that seems to be really has been an effective way for this group to work both with the county, with the state, and at the federal level. I mean, I've been in Mark's office advocating about the National Monument for Coast Areas before and he let us in the door because I assumed he couldn't keep us out because we were a persistent local group.
Supervisors are scared to death of you guys. They are, because you represent a constituency and a voice that's important. And that I know that group has given supervisors fits over the years when they haven't wanted to do what the group wants to do, and there's trouble there because you have credibility, which is more important. And whether you're opposing or supporting something that is happening at the board in that county, in that context, you have credibility. And the same thing with the aquarium. When the aquarium speaks, which is why I like doing stuff and having the aquarium being willing to sign on to it, because it carries credibility then to my colleagues as I'm hunting for votes. It says, yeah, this was thought through to a certain level. Because they won't sign on to everything. They sign on to things that they can back the science on enough to be able to support that policy. And so that's this notion of a group. If you're around long enough, if you have a clear enough voice and you're a constructive part of the conversation, even if you're opposed to something, but you have this collective, that can carry a tremendous amount of weight. And yeah, North Coast Association definitely does.
Good to hear.
Oh yeah, I think. Oh yeah. No, it's a good thing. It's absolutely a good thing.
Yeah, you guys again covered most of what I would probably say, so I don't have much to contribute here other than there's keep your eyes and ears out for what sort of local issues are bubbling up, and if it's something that you have some knowledge of, getting yourself up to speed and becoming that source of information for local policymakers or decision makers is the way to do it. So one thing in my tenure here at the aquarium that has bubbled up is plastic issues. Obviously, this whole area, all of the polystyrene bans are in place, straw bans are happening, that people are very eager to solve this ocean plastic pollution problem. And the more scientists that come out to speak up about it, including aquarium scientists, the better. And we've also done some work with the local youth, gathering different groups of people who have basically just different angles of this problem has been really helpful. And Carmel just passed a straw and utensil plastic ban, which is great, and the more are interested. So I don't know, I think it's just a matter of knowing what issues are coming up and engaging when you feel that you can.
And as the aquarium that got everybody, including me, to stop calling it marine debris and focus on plastic ocean pollution, because they had done enough of this work to realize that the terminology was getting in the way of what we were trying to accomplish. And so we've shifted, because words matter. We shifted the terminology to plastic ocean pollution. And it carries, to the general public, it carries more weight than marine debris. Nobody knows what to do with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, use that term.
Great.
So just as a follow-up, because we do have a question, how can we further fight plastic waste?
Oh, man.
Is that right? So given that the aquarium was successful in the initiative last year.
Yep, the plastic bag ban.
The plastic bag ban. What are they working on now? What is the sort of priorities?
Yeah, it's a huge priority on our minds right now, and the policy program, we're kind of in the process of grappling with what is our stance from the aquarium's perspective on what's the best way to solve this incredibly intricate, thorny, complex problem that is basically the byproduct of the way that we operate, in life. In my mind, it's become another climate change, and there's so many inputs and there's so many levers that you can push to try to influence, but what's the most effective? So product bans, I think, are something that people like to gin up a bunch of excitement about. It's great in the sense that, yeah, we have seen that they are effective. The results of, I think, a recent study just showed that the California bag ban has reduced plastic bag pollution on beaches.
Around the Monterey Bay.
Around Monterey Bay.
The statewide one hasn't been around long enough.
Okay. I heard some international coastal cleanup data that was looking at from September 2017 that showed some, and maybe it's anecdotal, I haven't looked into it yet, but basically these product bans, they do work on some level. But when you think of the fact that plastic production is just skyrocketing and recycling has pretty much stagnated at, I think it's 9% in the US for the last few years, I think a more comprehensive solution is needed. Unfortunately, that magic bullet of what do we switch to if we're not going to use plastic, that doesn't exist. So I think it's a multifaceted solution that's needed, focusing on policy stuff as well as engaging plastic manufacturers, innovating new materials, and kind of rethinking the way that we operate with single-use, the culture. So I know that's not really a solution, but we are still TBD as far as our solution. So
I think extending it, things that we've been trying to figure out is an extended producer responsibility kind of a process. At the state, it's a non-starter right now because that's determined to require a 2/3 vote in the legislature.
Can you just explain what extended producer
So
responsibility
an extended
is?
producer responsibility would be a program that looks at the entire life cycle of a product, from how much plastic goes into a product to the packaging, how it's being delivered, who makes money along the way, and then all the way to recycling, finding markets and all that. So it's a life cycle look. And it's getting everyone along the way to be a part of a solution, whether it's money into the system or building recycling, changing materials in order to reduce the amount of plastic that's there or that's being used in it, or something that is more recyclable given the current technology. And so it's spreading the burden, if you will, of the end result, that pollution item, across the spectrum of the industry and who's making the money off of it.
And it's not just about plastics as well, extended producer responsibility. People talk about it in the
Yeah.
context of pharmaceuticals, for example, and all sorts of other materials we use.
And we did one, we got very close for the mattress manufacturers, we've done with the state for batteries, and that got torpedoed. We got all the battery manufacturers on board, but it was the toy makers who like to distribute cheap offshore manufactured batteries in their toys. They killed the bill because they raised some opposition at the end. But we had all the major battery manufacturers on board with a way to then collect and get batteries out of, this is keeping batteries out of the waste stream and out of landfills and all that, having a place to go. It's an expensive program, but we'd figured out how to make that work across that entire sort of supply chain and life cycle of those products. But it's not an easy thing to do, and it's an easy thing to torpedo or to kill in the legislature because it's a very complex thing. And so we've done bans of plastic bags, which wasn't successful until we had at least 110, and now there are more jurisdictions who had done their own. And the industry, especially the grocers, were pulling their hair out because every jurisdiction's rules were a little bit different. So if they had stores in multiple jurisdictions, they had different rules to comply with. And so now we're talking about straws, polystyrene, and what I tell the advocates is make sure you make the rules a little bit different in each jurisdiction. And then the industry is going to come and want to be a part of the solution, ask the state to help be a part of the solution. And we can ban things, but that's ultimately not that good for the economy. It's not that productive. I mean, it's good, it makes us feel good. We're getting plastic out of the environment, but it's not a long-term solution. Finding a longer one, and I think extended producer responsibility kind of a concept is one that can be sustainable and long-term. We're not getting rid of plastics. It's a nice thought, But it's just not going to happen, not in this economy and not in our world. But reducing the impact of what that means is something that we can do, but we have to think a little bit more creatively and come up with a solution. We banned microplastics in cosmetics, and everybody thought, big win. Well, it wasn't, because the cosmetics industry knew they had to get rid of them. They were on a timeline to get rid of microplastics in cosmetics anyway, and all we did was move up the timeline. But if we didn't, if we were trying to ban them and the industry was not interested in banning them, we never would have got that policy through. So we sort of have to pick the battles, and you'll hear about everybody celebrating the ban on microplastics in cosmetics. And so the messaging around it has been great, waking people up. The reality of it isn't so great, because it was not something we were going to get through the legislature, but we got something through, and we've now raised the bar, raised what we can talk about, and let people know that we're making some progress going after plastics. So it's helpful in one sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Something we've learned at the aquarium from polling our visitors and whatnot is that the bans and these efforts are really good entry points to get people to start to care about the issue. They get engaged, they get jazzed. Unfortunately, sometimes it does tip over into that greenwashing, and someone might think the problem is solved because this ban has been put in place, and that's trickier to message and harder to. It's not a positive story. So how do you tell those negative stories and still get people to care and not be exhausted? So it's tricky.
Okay, there's several questions that speak to the barriers scientists and students face when wanting to get involved in policy. And one is with respect to the ecosystem analogy, how can you determine how much of an understanding you need in order to effectively influence decision making? So how much do you have to invest in building those relationships, understanding the rich ecosystem that you're embedded in? And sort of a corollary to that is, what opportunities are there if you're not a people person?
I am not a people person. Never have been, but somehow. So that don't let that dissuade you.
I could suggest something. So how many of you guys are graduate students? I'm assuming, yeah, that's kind of the name of the game here, right? So it seems to me that it's always curious to me why we do our science and then think that somebody's going to use it, which that's kind of a crazy way of thinking about it, because now you're stuck with some peer-reviewed paper. Hopefully, you guys got to get your stuff published, but you're stuck with some peer-reviewed paper and you're trying to get somebody interested in it, right? And if you're not a people person, that's even harder. But maybe the better way to go about this is to design it from the front end and decide who do I want to partner with in order to make my thesis relevant. So how many of you are doing thesis projects that you feel has some conservation relevance? Good, more than half of you guys, right? Maybe not. That's fine if you don't. That's okay. But if you feel like your thesis has some conservation relevance and you'd like it to be relevant, well, then the best way to make that happen is to make sure you understand who needs your information in order to make something happen. And so that means you need to understand not only your subject and your conservation issue, what are the potential solutions, what are the feasible solutions, and what entities are capable of making those solutions happen. And that to me is if thinking about that from the beginning, it may be that you're working on marine protected areas, and California Nature Conservancy, that's one of their programs right now is efficacy of marine protected areas in California. Well, maybe you should talk to the Nature Conservancy as you're designing your thesis, as opposed to try to make them pay attention to what you did beforehand. Or maybe you should talk to Mark Stone to understand about how do you get a plastic reduced, was it pernicious ocean plastics, whatever.
Plastic,
Oh, ocean plastic pollution, yeah.
Sorry, I haven't been brainwashed yet by the aquarium.
Plastic pollution.
But anyhow, all I'm trying to say is that understand what entities can use your information and design your thesis from the beginning. And that may be that you add something to your thesis, you're doing something in addition, but will also broaden your experience. When you come out of there, you'll have a network, not just of academics, but you'll also have a network of policymakers, NGO people, and so you'll come out of your graduate experience with a much richer experience at the end, and maybe your research will actually matter. Beyond just adding to our body of knowledge, which is just fine, but wouldn't it be even better if it added to our body of knowledge and it made the world a better place, whatever that means? And so I can't encourage you enough to think about your thesis projects beyond just your publication or getting your thesis written and past your committee, thinking about how do you partner with somebody that wants to use your thesis. Because I can guarantee you the aquarium can't pay enough people to do all the work they need to get done. And they love having a graduate student that's actually passionate, intelligent, and hardworking to work on issues that they want the answers for already. And so making your thesis relevant is important. I'll just give you one example I'm working on right now with the aquarium. Aquarium's interested in sustainability of fisheries. It turns out that tuna fisheries have a lot of bycatch of manta rays, which have really vulnerable life histories. And so we're working with the aquarium, partnering with them to work with the International American Tropical Tuna Commission, which is the international body that regulates tuna, to work with them to figure out how do we mitigate manta ray bycatch in the Eastern Pacific tuna fisheries. We're working with IATTC from the beginning so that the information we generate, they can use in order to, they want to make their fisheries more sustainable. If we just beat them on the head saying you're killing too many manta rays, that's a very different thing than saying, here's this information that you guys can use to make your fisheries more sustainable. And so that's kind of a partnership with IATTC, tuna fishermen, the aquarium, and an academic organization. So that's the kind of thing that I really encourage you guys to think about.
And since you're all graduate students and working on your thesis and all that, this may be heretical, but your thesis may not also be the ends, but sort of means along the way. I had my first year in the legislature, I had a science fellow. She was a PhD in mechanical engineering. And what somebody like that was doing in the legislature, I kept asking her, but she was interested in policy. And she was absolutely brilliant. And she did most of my, or really all of my environmental related legislation. She staffed my select committee. She did a lot of that because what she brought to the equation was the discipline of doing research and sort of the credibility around that. So she brought the work she had done, and I don't think she's doing anything that had to do with her thesis, but she's doing a lot now out of San Diego because that thesis was a way to get in the door, show you could do something. She came on board, showed she could do a whole lot more than just that, and is now off on an entire career that she's kind of built from that way. And she is someone that, since I have a relationship with her, if she calls up and says, you should look at this, I will look at that. Because I trust her, I know where she's coming from. And so finding an organization that has that credibility with policymakers, if that's what your bent is, and your point is really well taken. I'm not the only policymaker around. The legislature is not the only place where policy gets made. But if that's what you're interested in, you need to either work with an organization that has credibility with those individuals, and the work you're doing now could be your ticket into that door. Or my staff are all folks who worked for campaigns for me or that I had some connection with, and they have tremendous impact right now on the policy work that I'm doing because they work for me. And so that you can have any number of ways of being able to influence policy. Those who work for different state agencies who interact with the legislature are there. Other organizations have other ways of making those connections and having that credibility to say, this is a piece of policy you should be working on. We're always looking for bill ideas. and things that we can go off and do, things that hopefully we understand, not always, but usually. And we get those build ideas from any number of places, but I take them from individuals sometimes or organizations who have enough of a relationship to be able to kind of talk it through, have thought about a lot of the implications of it before I'm going to write it. But there's a lot of work that needs to get done before it's going to get to that point. So you're not going to take your thesis, very, very rarely going to take a thesis, the work that you're working on, and turn that into statewide or national policy. It's just not going to happen. But it's a building block towards other bigger things that you may not even know about now. But if you use that as a way to get in the door, a way to establish that credibility of that conversation, that's probably some of the best value you can get out of that work that you're doing right now.
Can I ask you guys a question, Mark, and both of you guys, because I think you've had the same experience there. I'm assuming you've either had scientists on your staff or you've been a scientist on staff because of your Canals Fellowship. How do you use scientists that are on your staff, and how are they most effective, and what's their job like, and then how do you use them effectively, and how did you, the other side is, what did you do, and how were you finding yourself effective?
The scientists that I've had on my staff really are no different than any other legislative aide doing the same kinds of things, but what they bring to the table is the discipline, the research tools, skills that others don't have, and they can go find things out more quickly and help translate them to me better than a lot of other folks without that same training.
Yeah, I would absolutely reiterate that. It's the critical thinking skills you gain in grad school and the research skills, rapid research skills, are super key to serving as a science, in some sort of role of a scientific advisor in these kind of offices. I will also get to the question of what if you're not a people person, because I totally identify with that. 3 years ago, I really was a serious introvert. And I was in the field with Elora, because we did our research together when I was at Columbia, and trying to speak to, the community stakeholders about my research was really nerve-wracking and terrifying. And there was also that cultural barrier as well. But since that point to now, it's been a lot of reaching out to people that I admire, getting informational interviews set up, and forcing myself to go through those interactions that have made me much more comfortable with speaking to people one-on-one. And I hate to say it, you just really have to force yourself to kind of get used to being comfortable with talking to people. I would also highly, highly advocate, and Dawn kind of touched on this, is finding a mentor that you feel very comfortable with and who you trust in the sense, and who also kind of like knows that context that you're working in and would be a trusted person to go to with that question, have I done enough work researching the context of this issue before going to engage on policy? Having a sounding board, someone that you can say, okay, this is my research, this is what I'm getting out of it, this is what I think is going on in the broader world, and what do you think, is so key. And it's difficult to identify those people, but when you do, just really try to approach that relationship from a, hey, I think you're awesome, I think I have a lot to learn from you, and this would be great. So mentor-mentee relationships, I would just say, are super key.